Welcome to Team Futurism. Today I'm interviewing Aaron Force. Aaron writes the publication Humanity's Shift, which focuses on consciousness and the future of humanity. Aaron, thanks for coming on the show.
Peter, thank you very much. I'm very excited to talk about these topics that we're going to lean into, which is going to be basically focused on future perspectives of things. And that is entirely my scope of passion right there. So
yeah, basically everything that you write about on your Substack publication, it kind of overlaps with my interests. So there are definitely a lot of different directions that we can go, and we'll see how far we get in all the different directions. But I kind of want to start just like talking a little bit about your backstory. For one thing, I saw that you live in the Seattle area, which is actually where I'm from. I come from the Northwest. I grew up in small towns. My parents still live in Port Angeles, Washington. So that's definitely like my home turf up there.
Yeah.
Are you from that area or like?
Yeah. I'm a native Washingtonian. You may be familiar with the Skykomish Valley area, so that is sort of northeast of Seattle. We're nestled in where I'm sitting right now. My home is nestled in right at the foothills of the Cascade Mountains on the west side. And so if we were to walk outside, we'd see mountains all around, basically. So it's a very gorgeous area here. And I've lived in Washington my whole life. And in this particular area, I'm pretty much most of that. So, yeah.
That's great. Yeah. So, yeah, I mostly from Port Angeles, and then I went to school in Bellingham. So I'm pretty familiar with all that area. And,
okay, well, I have a son that lives in Bellingham. We'll love it up there, too.
Yeah, super beautiful area. I do miss it up there. I'm in Sacramento right now, so different like change of scenery, but still definitely like West Coast vibes.
Right, so, West Coast.
It's kind of interesting. A lot of like sci-fi comes from the Northwest, and in particular that area. I noticed that actually Tom Robbins, not really a sci-fi guy, but maybe like sort of maybe associated in some ways with that world. But Tom Robbins just died last week. Did you see that? And he lived up very close to you, actually. Are you familiar with his work at all?
I don't think so. What would that work be that I might know?
He's the guy who most famously wrote Even Cowgirls Get the Blues, that at one point was made into a movie. I don't know. He's kind of like a goofball, a little bit, just like a goofball fiction writer. But also, I mean, like the guy who wrote Dune, Frank Herbert, he's from Tacoma, I think, right? So there is some like sci-fi and futurism happening up there, just like in the ether. I feel like I always kind of felt that anyway. Do you feel that? Is there like a community of sci-fi folks, and is that kind of what got you interested in futurism?
I don't know so much on that, but I do come across in a lot of things that I have explored in the last 10 years or so since my awakening was that the West Coast in general, and this kind of makes sense when you look at Hollywood and you look at Silicon Valley and the Bay Area with technology, and even up here a little bit in Seattle and then up in Vancouver. Eckhart Tolle lives up in that area.
Oh yeah.
Grimes was born there in Vancouver, I think. There's this whole. Some people think that there is a sort of a magnetic vibe here. I'm talking like literally, about ley lines and sort of magnetic issues around the Earth. I have seen this multiple times that the West Coast is a source of I don't know, a greater magnetic activity, and people have looked at that like, well, maybe there's a correspondence with creativity and innovation, and so I kind of see that. But I'm not so familiar on the sci-fi scene as far as people up here originating sort of in that field. But I love sci-fi. It is definitely, it's my favorite genre of movie. Basically, I don't read much fiction because I just don't have so much time anymore. If I'm reading, it's generally nonfiction. But
that's so interesting about the that theory about the crazy people and creativity. I always kind of chalked it up to the people who are on the West Coast. They were like the adventurers who wanted to keep going west, right? And then you can't go west anymore, so maybe you just start like taking your ideas to the the last frontier is up in the stars, I don't know. You mentioned this a second ago, and this tends to be part of your backstory that you had an awakening of some sort in 2015. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. And this was a singular day, almost just a few moments, and probably the most important of my life. And for some reason, I can't really remember exactly when it happened. So I've been telling people 2015. I almost think maybe it was 2014. but what happened was it was one particular day where my wife and I were with some mutual friends, and we were at their place of business. And I was going through a very difficult time in my life at that time. It's just very sort of emotionally wrought with self-doubt and self-anger and hatred, actually, because I was kind of coming into that point in my life where I wasn't really feeling like I was accomplishing much. I felt like I just didn't fit. And so I chalk that up to what I have since discovered is referenced by Steve Taylor. He's a lecturer at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. And he has studied awakening a lot, actually more from an academic perspective. So I found that really, really interesting. And one of his conclusions in his studies has been that the psychological discord or struggle that tends to mount up, I think of it like a pressure. And when you get so much pressure, at some point something gives or something transmutes. And that's how I look at sort of this idea of spontaneous awakening. And that happened to me. I didn't know walking into it what at all had happened to me. I wasn't looking for it. I was definitely an evangelical Christian at that time. I wasn't looking for anything woo-woo or different or anything outside of the narrative, right? And this is why I know it was so profound and so real, is because I wasn't looking for it. It just happened. And in a matter of moments, in speaking with this individual who was just going absolutely bonkers with success in his business, and here I wasn't, I think kind of my ego kind of literally like deflated in that moment, or there was just something that popped in a sense. And he was speaking to me, and then I kind of lost track of what he was saying, and it was sort of like the Charlie Brown wah 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 wah, right? And I was in my own world while my whole structure of who I believed that I was, sort of that ego-based identity, it all just dissolved. And I'm talking just in moments, just seconds. And it was just, I was left with that I am not my job. I am not my failures. I'm not my problems. I'm not anything but me, whatever that is. But it was just a moment of pure awareness. And you don't walk back from that unchanged. And so my whole path from that moment to now and beyond has been sort of this riding out that big bang moment of expansion, of awareness. And
so it is a little bit of like you felt the sense of your ego breaking down and being more connected to broader consciousness. Is that sort of the
very much? Yeah. So basically, the idea is that you're pulled from the world of thought, right, as sort of a shallow level end of the pool, and deeper into awareness, which is kind of behind the more embodied state, behind thought of who we are, and not even who we imagine we are, because then we get back into thought again a little bit, thought and belief. And so it's just a true stripping away, and you're just left standing there. I was left standing there like, I don't know. I do know who I am. Like, I can't put it into words because that's thought, but I felt suddenly at home and expansive, like it was more than just my vessel, but that I was more just part of everything.
Yeah, so what's interesting about this to me is that this seems like it's a pretty common experience, and you can read about this, right? For people who, take drugs or like meditate forever. And I feel like I can put myself in the shoes of that, situation being there, especially like if you are in some sort of like a drug-induced state. But like, you experienced this just in the course of your day-to-day life, right? Which means that like somehow like, and this is obviously true, like our brains are able to tap into that sensation without lots of meditation or without drugs. It is a state that's there, that's accessible, and you actually experienced it. That's the interesting part about this to me.
Yeah, exactly. Unwillingly, unexpectedly, on everything. I was launched into that, and the only motivation that I can see for that, which makes perfect sense to me from where I'm at now looking back on it, was that just psychological mess I was in, the discord, the angst, the frustration, the worry, the anxiety, the depression. It just heated to this boil when my buddy Jeff was talking about how successful he was doing in life. And by the way, he had only 2 or 3 years earlier, maybe, just gotten out of prison. He was in for nearly 3 decades, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It was, and so it sounds terrible. It sounds extremely selfish, but that's where I was at that point in my life. Was why the hell is this guy so damn successful? And he's done more in whatever it was, 2 or 3 years, than I felt like I had done within my entire life.
I want to see if I can get your thesis, kind of like for your broad writings, you know, if I can make it make sense in my head a little bit. Like you experienced this, and so you have this thesis that right now, because of the state of the world, how the state of the world is so anxiety and stress driven, and it just can't go on for like environmental reasons, and I mean, all the different ways we could destroy ourselves, right? That you have this theory that humanity collectively will start to, without drugs and without like years of meditation, start to experience this same sort of like conscious connectedness. Is that a fair way to
I think that's surprisingly perceptive of you. Yeah. And I think psychedelics will play a part for some. I think meditation and spiritual practice will play a part for some. And then for a lot of people, I think there will be more and more of this spontaneous type of awakening into a more expanded state of consciousness. And what is applicable for the individual, i.e. myself in that particular case, with the buildup of frustration, existential uncertainty, just almost a feeling of hopelessness about who I am and the future. I think what got me pretty much on this direction was the understanding that what could happen for the individual could happen for society.
Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on the ego itself, because you've written, I mean, maybe you can even, you know, describe what that is. It's been a long time since I've taken any psych classes, and, you know, obviously you vary from like standard psych definitions of the ego too.
Yeah.
But yeah, so tell me about like the ego, and also you have this article that I have not finished, but about how we've gone through an ego evolution in the past, or there's a theory about this at least, and maybe we're going through a new one now, and kind of connect those dots for me.
Yes, absolutely. So the fact that you haven't been in psych class for a while and may not remember all the ins and outs of the ego is okay, because you're right. It's basically, it is a different sort of perspective. It's taking the idea of ego that helps us function, right? Really as people, because we need to have this sort of self-identity and an awareness of self related into a larger context for us just to be able to, you know, relate to our environment. But on the more spiritual end, the perspective also has kind of, I don't know, maybe hijacked the word ego. So it's not necessarily textbook, okay, but it's the idea that we have still a paradigm of separation collectively, which means we understand our world as everything is siloed, everything is divided. You and me are clearly distinct from one another, but, you know, are we? So, and this has happened, that we've been in this paradigm for, I think, and others have said, including Steve Taylor, who I mentioned before, that maybe about 6,000 years ago, something changed in humanity to affect our consciousness, so that in the more ancestral time, we were obviously more connected with nature, probably
Mhm.
more of an animist kind of perspective. All things are alive, or spirit flows through all things. A much more expansive state of consciousness. So you'll hear me talk about expanded consciousness a lot. It's not necessarily that it's literally expanded, but the idea is that ego is constricted
Hmm.
and channeled, and this is my lane and that's your lane over here, and everything is divided. Everything, we study every subject in isolation, when now we're beginning to understand that everything is integrated. That's part of this shift that we'll get into. But yes, so the ego is basically, in the context that I use it and others in the spiritual community and in this greater field that we call conscious evolution, that the ego is the thing that keeps us in mind, separated from everything else, from each other, from nature, of course, right? We trample nature because we don't realize we are nature. We are an expression of nature, and really from an underlying order of the cosmos, where harmony reigns and interconnection and all those things. Ego is a perceptual mode, basically a state of consciousness that rejects the greater interconnection of all things. So
When you look out into the world today, do you see, apart from your own experience, do you see any evidence of people, kind of like waking up in this sense for their ego, like dying? Because I mean, I don't know, not that I've thought about this much when when I read the news or look out into the world, I see maybe possibly the opposite of this. Although not that I've like been looking or anything, but I mean, there's so much division, and I mean, I don't even need to describe it. It's just kind of like an obvious thing that exists.
We all see it, right? So yep. So I would just say that, just despite all appearances, I think there is definitely out there, and I see it even on Substack. I'm in this circle of people algorithmically that we're all basically seeing it. We're seeing from a higher level, from a more expanded, sort of transcendent level of the problems that we see in society. So it's obviously, it's not society wide right now that people are awakening to this higher understanding or perception that things are not fundamentally divided, which leads to conflict and destruction and chaos and disharmony of every kind. So yeah, there are definitely pockets that are growing and growing and growing, despite what we see in the media, which is absolute division everywhere. That's part of the nature probably of media, is they don't focus on everything that is good and that is happening for the betterment of humanity, because that's not going to sell as well, for one.
Yeah, what's funny is you do actually see this on Substack. I mean, I have seen this before. I've actually interviewed a guy a while ago who has a similar perspective about. Also, there's like the Hegelian e-girls, right? About how like we're in a dialectic and we're moving forward by this like a synthesis of division, that sort of thing. That's definitely in the culture right now. And I think that Hegelian girls themselves, I think that that disbanded. But I mean, like that movement, and also like the metamodernism.
I never heard of them, but that sounds fantastic. Yeah.
I wrote an article about them, and yeah, they were, oh man, I don't even know to this day how much of a gimmick it was, but it was this group of girls who would just get together and do online videos, and I think that they had like Discord servers too, where they would just like be cute girls talking about Hegelianism or something.
I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, it was kind of great. I think that they had internal division or something, but yeah.
Yeah, how ironic.
That's zeitgeist, right? Like there is something there, and I know that we should talk about modernism too. Yeah,
there totally is, and there is a shift of understanding that is going on. So I write Humanity's Shift, which basically started as this idea that we are shifting out of the ego-based paradigm into a more, what I call, spiritual one. Okay, which basically is just the idea of again, an expanded state of consciousness. It's just the opposite of ego spirit. It's the spiritual community kind of tends to use that more, but we're definitely between paradigms. And I know you have more of maybe a technological background. We're shifting in multiple ways. In fact, it's almost like it's a total evolutionary shift. I see consciousness is shifting. God, technology right now. I mean, it's hitting that inflection point where it's just going to go wild. Like, I see so many things changing at once, and that's where I'm trying to straddle all this, synthesize all of this. Where are we headed? And there are so
Well, I
many
mean, like we could actually. I know you've talked about this before with what was it, Charlotte Dunn? I believe you had a conversation with her.
Yeah, yes,
Where I think that you mentioned that you do like to think like 1,000 years in the future, and
yeah,
I
it's
kind of do
helpful,
too.
I think.
And let's just go there just for a second, because I mean, like, do you envision, and this is a real possibility, we could just upload our minds to the cloud in maybe even within our lifetimes or something? It's not like it's crazy, but it's not like that crazy at this point.
It's not that crazy, and I think it will be
There's
happening
technology
sooner.
that could, expand until it's that powerful, and then we could, take over the whole entire energy source of our local sun and then expand out from there. I mean, there are things that on paper
Right.
are crazy, and then all of a sudden we are one like mass global consciousness plus AI. I don't know, like things get crazy. How crazy do you get out there with these thoughts, and can you envision anything that
Yeah,
makes sense
I don't know. I mean, one can go, and that's part of what's fascinating to me is you can really go as far as you want to go. You can push it to as far as your imagination can possibly take it. Ray Kurzweil, I know you must be familiar with him. The singularity is near, and the singularity is nearer, and the things that he talks about, I see that could absolutely happen. So some of the things that he would say is perhaps our galaxy, or even eventually the entire cosmos, could basically become a data center, right? And to what degree of expansion will human intelligence, AI, who knows what else? I mean, I consider the possibilities of alien alliance. I mean, if there are advanced intelligences somewhere out there or in other dimensions, and if we can reach a level of maturity in our consciousness that some kind of disclosure or connection happens, what influence would that have upon us? And so it is absolutely wild. I mean, it goes further probably than we can even comprehend, which is what a singularity will do, because all of the rules of any paradigm or framework kind of break down, right? I mean, when you hit the technological singularity, for one, I mean, all bets are off. I mean, anything could happen because the old rules don't apply anymore. The laws of physics almost don't apply anymore in a singularity, such as black holes and what they do with light and
What
matter.
is your take on religion right now? It sounds like you grew up with a religious background. So did I. And I mean, there's a strain of thought about the singularity. I'm blanking on the guy's name, but there's a Houston professor who has this theory. Tipler, is that it? Something like that? That when we do achieve the singularity, that is achieving the Christian God. And he spells this out in some way. I can't articulate it right now exactly, but there's a theory about how that is actually the Christian God, and that is our heaven that we are just kind of like stumbling our way into. So maybe there's some way where like religious stories are still relevant, even in the context of futurism. I've been, total atheist for the last, couple decades. So those stories don't resonate with me too much anymore. But there is a lot of like still, religion is definitely not dead in the culture. It still resonates with a ton of people.
Sure.
What are your thoughts about religion right now? And do you think that it's a force that's moving us towards the direction that you see, or is it holding us back from, becoming more connected and less egoistic?
Well, you just put it right out there, didn't you? So, I mean, this will be a controversial statement for some people, but on the note that you were talking about previously about technology and singularity leading us to God, basically. Are you familiar with Chardin, Pierre Teilhard? He was
No.
oh yeah, he wrote The Phenomenon of Man and some other writings that are difficult to read. Well, number one, because he was a French Jesuit, and all his writings have been translated into English, and they were complicated enough anyway and then some things.
Was this like long ago, or is he contemporary?
He was in my mind, I'm envisioning him being somewhere around turn of the century, but I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on him, but he had this concept of a mega point,
Hmm.
which was the idea that eventually all things will converge. I don't think he even understood the singularity at that point, but that we are somewhat evolving. And these were controversial things, especially back then when religion was so much stronger. But he was also a Jesuit, but he was also a paleontologist. And he kind of mixed all of these things and mysticism and came up with the fact that, well, all things may be leading us basically to Christhood ourselves.
Hmm.
And that's one area where I see him. Well, I see what he's saying, but I don't really agree with it from my perspective. But
I'll have to look him
acknowledge.
up. Yeah, it sounds very similar to I want to call him like Frank J. Tipler. That name's now in my head. Frank
Well, he's
Tipler.
probably influenced uh, by him.
Yeah, I bet
So,
so. Okay, yes, that is. I'm getting his name right. So
oh, okay, all
make sure I'm
right.
not spreading fake news out there. Frank J. Tipler is the guy I'm thinking about. The Christian
Okay,
guy.
I'm not
The
familiar, so
similarities. Yeah.
that's good. I'll look into that further too. So, but no, I don't necessarily subscribe to that so much. Religion is a tricky one. Yeah, I was not raised in a Christian home, but I had a conversion moment when I was maybe 12 or 13 or something like that.
Hmm.
And honestly, that felt like a very real experience to me too. But and I lived that well into adulthood, and until this awakening happened, which I still was on that trail for a long time, and eventually, probably 2, 3, maybe even 4 years later, there was just a day when it hit me like, no, I just nothing of that resonates with me anymore.
Interesting. Okay, so
Yeah,
one was the ending of the old
yeah,
view, and
yeah.
that's very interesting.
Me
Huh.
a while. It took me a while to get to that point. I had awakening, and I was continuing along with that Christian perspective for a long time, and then through self-examination, study of spiritual things, but more than anything, just going deep within and figuring out, what it is I believe or perceive. It just no longer fit anymore. It wasn't an outright rejection. I never rejected it. I just sort of had a second awakening one time where I was like, no, I just don't see that anymore. And it just couldn't totally resolve itself because I couldn't imagine a Godhead over and above creation, because that gets into the separation paradigm again. And when you look at the Bible, everything is separation.
Yeah.
God is over humanity, and mankind is over nature, has dominion over the nature. No equality, it's dominion. And the doctrine of sin is about separation,
Hmm.
and the penalty of hell is about separation from God, and everything was about separation, and I couldn't resolve that anymore. What was
Religion is
being
divisive too, right? Like I do
it
still
is
see
always
religion as
one
more
or the other.
divisive than
Yeah.
I don't know, than like humanism, like strict humanism. I feel like it could unite everyone if we just like get around, the values of
Yeah,
humanism. I see
but
literally
somehow
nothing wrong with that.
yeah, yeah, but somehow it can't seem to globally unite. But
Yeah,
when you start thinking
true.
about a spiritual perspective which says all things basically are connected at a fundamental level. You look at an ecosystem, and everything, that though there are distinct species and different types of plants and animals and land and water and all these interactions, even though things are sort of technically separated, they all act as one. An ecosystem is like a whole organism. And I mean, before humans came on the scene, they would last for as long as, unless climate changed or something,
Mhm. Right.
right? They're enduring and adaptive and resilient and harmonious and all of those things that we need to be right now. And that some of us are starting to see that there is a new paradigm of connection, and we're coming out of the egoic one, but we're also in that liminal right now. We're kind of, one foot is in the old. We have to operate within the system to survive. At least we can know we are in the system rather than unconsciously embedded in it. But we're also striding towards that next step where things are more expansive, interconnected. We embrace complexity, paradox, which then starts getting into metamodernism and those types of frameworks, which I think are so valuable right now. Yeah.
Do you consider yourself a panpsychist? Like there's consciousness in everything?
I don't.
Okay.
I mean, I respect the theory, but I don't think necessarily everything is consciousness or is conscious, I should say. Like, the theory might go that even an electron might have a certain level of awareness that it knows it's an electron.
Mhm.
Or no, I don't see it. I would be more of a pan-spiritist, which says that consciousness flows through all things. Again, it's that more ancestral,
I don't know about
indigenous.
that term, but I like that concept. It's interesting.
It's nothing I invented. Again, I heard it from Steve Taylor, who's just been an
Okay.
absolute wealth of information for me and guidance of my journey. So I promote him wherever I can. And actually, I don't know if you saw it, but more recently, I did write this piece about the fact that I think all things are consciousness.
I think that I
Which,
saw that. That's where I picked up on maybe you are a
yeah, I don't
panpsychist
necessarily
actually.
think that everything is conscious, like has an awareness and interacts with the electron next to it, or in a conscious way or whatever. But I do think that all of reality is some kind of reflection of an initial source state of consciousness. That it's the material reflection of consciousness. If we think of it's almost, you can almost think of it from the biblical perspective, where you have God, and then God created the universe. Um, but there are those that would say that God also inhabits all things,
Right? Oh yeah,
right?
totally.
So what
Mhm.
is that? That's panentheism. There's pantheism, there's panentheism, I think, which would say that there's an external transcendent, and then there's God as part of all things. I think that literally everything that we see is somehow a reflection. Everything that's matter, which really isn't matter, right? We know it's energy
Mhm.
at the base level. So everything is really just energy, and our perceptions of that. I mean, that's a whole different conversation too, about how our perceptions, our senses relate to the energy that's outside of us. But I mean, I'm
Yeah.
deviating, but I think all things actually are. And I think that brief article kind of spells it out more. It's difficult to just say it and have somebody go, oh, well, that makes sense. But you get into it a little bit more and you break it down. That it to me it makes sense. And for some people, that's probably weirder than panpsychism.
Do you know this guy, Donald Hoffman? He wrote this book a couple years ago, The Case Against Reality: Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes. Do you know about this guy?
No.
He did the podcast circuit a couple years ago, and I think he has like a TED talk. But his whole thing is that, oh man, it's been too long. I probably can't explain this too well, but something about how like he views consciousness as, or the human experience as, basically the way we interface with reality is we are not at all interfacing with what's really there. We
Right.
are interfacing with, like, we're on a computer screen and we're looking at, like, oh, here's the trash bin icon, and that's
Mhm.
like the equivalent of like a tiger or something like that. The tiger isn't there, just in the
Mhm.
same sense like the trash can icon on your desktop is not really there. It's a representation that evolution gave us the power to interpret, all just like the energy, right? That
Fascinating,
is
isn't it?
there.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
fascinating. But the underlying substrate is just energy. It's just
Yes.
patterns of energy, different frequencies, different cohesive states where it makes a table. But really, what we see, what we hear, what we perceive, it's not really there. It's all one step removed, and it's sort of
Like, it
like the
sounds
difference.
slightly crazy to say that, but that's actually true. Like that's
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's very true. I mean, that can, any scientist could say, yeah, yeah, that's right. But I don't think very many people understand that. But it's like the difference, kind of, between DOS and Windows, where
Mm, mhm.
DOS was the original kind of operating system of just gobbledygook to me. But then Gates and the Microsoft team said, well, let's make a user interface where the user can then deal with the interface, even though the inner workings of everything behind it, the code, let alone, the hardware of just circuitry and silicon and whatever. But what we experience on the screen in Windows or any other modern operating system, there's a user interface as opposed to the underlying code and binary system
And
behind
we're
it.
just using
Fast.
we're just using words from the English language to try to articulate any of this, and then so it's we're like 50 layers deep of not touching reality like at all. Little tangent here about I want to ask you. I've been kind of curious. Have you ever read Julian Jayne's? And do you know about this book? It's the origins of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. Are you at all familiar with this guy?
I'm zero familiar. Sounds very interesting.
Can I give you his pitch? I feel like you might.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about this enough, but somehow it fits in with your view of a lot of these things, especially like maybe the ego breakdown. I think, and I've talked about this on the podcast before. He was a psychologist, I think at Yale or something, like in the 70s. And he wrote this book that was kind of revolutionary. It's never been proven. It's just a theory, and it's like something that's maybe hard or impossible to prove. But it's this idea that go back maybe like 2,000 years, like not very long ago, like at all in human history. And humans, theory goes, did not at all have consciousness like we do today. He says that if you read any literature like written long ago, like the Iliad or anything in the Bible, there is no internal thought at all. There's no like internal reflection. It just doesn't exist in literature past a certain point. All that happens is God speaks to a person, and then that person does that thing. And so you'll see, Nestor or whoever in the Iliad being like, God spoke to me and I did this. And Achilles, the same thing. God spoke to me, and so I did this. That's the whole.
It wasn't necessarily a personal agency, is what I'm gathering.
There's none. It just doesn't exist, and which is fascinating. And that's actually like it's true, I guess. He says that language developed to a certain point where we were able to then make analogies, and even the word "I" is an analogy. You can't understand that concept unless analogies make sense to your brain. And there was something when we started to use language in that way that the two halves of our brain kind of like started working together and integrating in a way they previously hadn't. And that's when we started having an interiority that is our modern view of like how we view ourselves and how we view consciousness. And so, you can read the Iliad, it doesn't exist. If you just read the Odyssey, there is some interiority. It popped up. And then across the world in literature, it started popping up. So this is like, there's like literary analysis here, but also just like a new theory about how consciousness as we know it and love it today emerged. Very fascinating. It's crazy fascinating.
It does sound fascinating. It does sound fascinating. And I think, again, that previous, actually, some of that sounds like more of the psychological ego, I think, where I think ego helps process and differentiate. And I think that helps lead to language. And so I think maybe in our past there was some expansion upon that idea of ego in that way, manipulating how we interact. Like we symbolically, there's me, there's you, there's words that describe things and only those things. And I mean, I definitely can see that. I think this idea of the true shift of a more collective, and by the way, when I talk about ego, it is more sort of collective humanity, dysfunctional state perception. Like maybe we have this psychological version of ego, which helps us differentiate and interact with our environment and each other. But also the idea, generally, when I'm speaking of ego, it's much more collective for humanity, how we collectively perceive our world. And it does tend to be dysfunctional, right? It's geared towards self often at the expense of others, not in every case. But I think that there was a clear introduction of that roughly about 6,000 years ago. And the theory goes that perhaps climate change had actually occurred at that time, although it was a cooling trend. And God, what was his name? Randall Carlson is a fascinating figure. He was on Joe Rogan's podcast. He also alluded to this idea of about 6,000 years ago, and what he termed it neoglaciation, I think, was a cooling period that we can scientifically we can core and look back and project that it was about that time. And bringing Steve Taylor back into it again, we can notice through anthropology that things changed in society at about that time frame. We started seeing more weaponry, more class division, kind of based on number one, how people were buried, who they were next to, or whether they were, more glorified in their burials somehow. There are cues that point to this time frame. And I've seen it elsewhere, although I can't pinpoint it with a reference, but that at some point we went from that truly ancestral, indigenous, everything is one. We are one with nature. Nature is our mother, whatever. How you want to think of, we all pretty much have an intuitive perspective of that time frame, I think. Even our modern day indigenous help us gather that. We can look at, for instance, the American Indians and how we know that they've been versus the settlers and the colonists that came in and basically overthrew everything. Two different mindsets that met, and dysfunction drastically appeared.
It's interesting. This is a theme on this podcast, that it's very hard to look forward without at some level looking back. It's just an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I want to maybe wrap up by talking about metamodernism. Maybe we can touch on a couple other points here too, but we've kind of danced around this. I have talked about it at length in other episodes, but you wrote this in your piece about metamodernism, and I thought that this was a nice summary of it. You said, it's a combination of the best of our two most relevant contemporary philosophies, modernism and postmodernism. While both fall short in some areas in capturing the spirit and complexity of our time, they also each hold strong points. Metamodernism seeks to blend the merits of both, and therefore becomes a more sophisticated means of understanding. I think that's a really nice way to put it. And maybe just to do a hard definition for any listeners who aren't familiar, metamodernism it's this new episteme that developed, around in the early 2000s, and a couple of philosophers started for their names, but in Europe, they noticed that postmodernism wasn't really, it just didn't have the cultural relevance or resonance that it did previously. And they started noticing this new thing where works of art would come out, or books. A classic example is Dave Eggers' heartbreaking work of Staggering Genius, that sort of thing, where it's both modern and postmodern, and it kind of like oscillates between the two. There's an irony, but also sincerity, and there's this like kind of weird happy marriage between being ironic but also being kind of sincere. You're able to do both, and they noticed that this was happening in the culture, and they gave it the name metamodernism, and it kind of stuck. And over the last couple of years, people have been realizing that, hey, we can't abandon postmodernism, even though it did kind of lead us to nowhere. We still have to grapple with the concepts that we took from postmodernism, but we're going back towards a modernist perspective, that there are grand narratives. For example, we have to have some sort of grand narratives. And so I just recently interviewed Greg Dember, who wrote a book called Say Hello to Metamodernism. And I think with books like that, and also maybe even conversations like this, I think that this can become, probably in the next couple of years, a fairly widely, known and accepted term. So, I mean, yeah, tell me about how you learned about this term and what your thoughts are about it.
Well, and touching off of that, again, I've been speaking about the circles I maintain on Substack. Even it is a common term that's floating around, my corner of Substack anyway. Maybe not everywhere, but people are definitely becoming familiar with it. And I think people are really embracing it once they understand it, because it does capture so much of the spirit of the times, where we're trying to, step out of the binary and that egoic paradigm and embrace something new in the future, which is more holistic, harmonious, embraces nature, embraces the diversity of life that we have. And to be honest, we're in a very chaotic time with multiple crises right now. We can't come from it from a singular perspective. And metamodernism really helps us embrace that paradox of the old and the new and help us navigate, but lead us more functionally in the future, I think, because that's what integration does. That's what, when you have the dialectic and you're able to figure out how the polar opposites meet and integrate, there's something powerful that happens there. I think there's a synergy that can definitely guide us. But metamodernism, I think, is absolutely the framework that probably best suits our time, because we are in that liminal space. We are transitioning out of the paradigm of separation to people are grasping towards more holistic considerations, right? We are in that shift, and that shift is a bit of a twilight zone where, there's paradox. There is actually, I think, a sense that it's not just one or the other is true, but a paradox will say that maybe both are true at the same time of whatever it is. And how can that be? But sometimes it is. For instance, complementarity. So when you look at when we started to discover the quantum realm, this idea of complementarity began to emerge, which you look at light, and depending on how you observe it, it can be a wave or it can be a particle.
Mm-hmm.
But both are true. They're completely different. They're polar opposites, basically, but they are both true. And in fact, you have to have the understanding of both at the same time to capture the true perspective of the reality of light.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we're at a time where we really need to embrace contradiction and paradox and all of these things. And metamodernism is able to grasp from wherever. It doesn't have that prideful, this is the right way. We get more pragmatic. We say what works here, what works there, what works in modernism versus postmodernism, what works in anything, any field over here, and its polar opposite over here, and tries to find that integration. That is so absolutely powerful. And not only is it just powerful, it's inspiring to me. I light up just when we started talking about it, because it brings possibility rather than...
Me too. Yeah. That's how I feel about it too. Yeah. Boy, there is a lot there, and I do feel like this conversation did just open up a million more conversations. But yeah, maybe that's actually 100%.
I told you that sometimes, sometimes you end up raising more questions than you've solved in an interview, and that's okay. I think that sometimes that's the true mark of success. Actually, have an interview is raise more questions.
Yeah, and honestly, this feels all very hopeful to me, actually, and I like that. I'm an optimist by nature, and it feels very hopeful to have a lot of these perspectives. Aaron, what are you up to now, and what are you working on in terms of your writing, and where can people find out more about you?
Okay, so on Substack, I am at Humanities Shift. So again, we document basically the concept of the shifting nature of our times, whether it's consciousness, technology, whatever. So Substack is the best place to find me. That is where I'm most active. I love it there. I love the community there. As far as other projects, I do have a manuscript that I have written. I'm trying to get some agents, some literary representation out of that. And I'm excited about those possibilities as well. And beyond that, I'm trying to meet with many fascinating people like you, as many as possible, because I always come out of a dialogue with this with something more, and so that's so exciting. So, but you can find even that on Substack. So that's where I live right now.
Great. Yeah, I will drop links to all of that in the show notes. And Aaron, thanks for coming on the show. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much. Such a pleasure.